Let's do it. I'll let you steer the conversation and whatever you want to go to and questions you want to ask. And, again, I've got some stats about where we're at and even other provinces and stuff like that. So
it's time.
Yeah, let's do it.
We're going. We're live, ladies and gentlemen. Hello and welcome to Dream Chasers, Interviews with the Future. I'm your host, Adam Carswell. Hi, Grandma. And today we are joined by my good friend and now repeat guest on the show, Travis Day. We had Travis on, now I'm trying to think of it. Do you remember what episode number it was?
No, I don't. Got it saved on my phone though.
Yeah, it was, it was within the past 3 or 4 months. I know Travis through my wife, Nikki. He is a nurse, so is she. And there's been some really cool back and forth that Travis and I have now had being here in Newfoundland that have really continued to open my eyes. And I think hopefully will open the eyes of as many people as possible. And I guess, we might want to lead this episode with a little bit of a disclaimer, but keep in mind, we're viewing this through we're viewing it through our eyes. And so just because we think that it's best doesn't mean that we know it's best. And I think that's how everyone should pretty much approach life in general. It's just
exactly
not always thinking you know best, but just trying to do the best you can. And so that's what we're going to do here today is uncover some of the, just truths of what's really going on right now and not being talked about through the lens of a medical professional and someone who's really been able to stand his ground and stand up for what's right. Things like critical thinking. I remember you talked about in your first episode how as you go through your medical training, they drill the idea of critical thinking into your head. And now we're getting to a point where critical thinking is getting thrown out the window. So before we dive in, just for anyone here who's not familiar with you, Travis, if you could just kind of tell a little bit about your background, where you come from, where you're at now professionally, and then we'll go from there.
Perfect. So my name's Travis. I'm 27, been a registered nurse now, graduated from Memorial University, Newfoundland for about 4 years now. So I've been working mostly in long-term care, which is a lot of dementia care, Alzheimer's and things of that nature. So that's just where I landed and I've taken an interest in that. And obviously, that's become controversial as well because this is all about protecting the vulnerable. And, thankfully in this province, we can say that we've done that pretty successfully. We've protected the vulnerable in the long-term care homes and that kind of thing. So it's allowed me to have a lens to look at this and reevaluate, the silver lining of certain things we do versus, the maximum we can do versus kind of what's a little more acceptable with, risk benefit kind of calculation. So I've also been involved with this group called Canadian Frontline Nurses. They've taken a lot of heat, but we've also gotten a lot of love. We're just, again, we're running uphill. We're speaking against the grain and the narrative. And again, that comes with its own battle of controversy, but that's fine. I'm no stranger to that. And I don't mind that because when I have a principle and a value and I'm going to stick to that and I have a lot of conviction in it, it doesn't bother me if I'm the minority opinion of a certain thing. It's just my way of life right now is to raise a few red flags to get people thinking and to, like you said, not claim that I'm right about everything. That's impossible. And I hope nobody's doing that. I'd like to see less of that. People denouncing that kind of superiority or the science, what because really pisses me off. The science. Yeah. That phrase has become just mutated into this, what I would call almost like a religiosity at this point. So you've got like your idols and your totems that you can wield against people. For example, even just the masks have become like an idol to say, well, I'm not going to listen to you if you refuse to, meet me at this level and wear this one thing. It's just a mask. So there's all these stepping stones to argument that are, not that they're unscientific. It's just that there's certain inferences being made about what the science is, and then you aren't allowed essentially to question it after that point. And to me, it doesn't matter who gets to set the standard for what the science is. Any other person, especially a professional, should be able to question it. because in my mind, what a good scientist does is sets forth a hypothesis or a theory, and then if someone comes along and says, hey, here are all the ways that you're completely wrong, you're absolutely out of your mind, and this is just so wrong, then it's your job as a good scientist to listen to them. And if they're absolutely wrong, then you debunk them and you say, no, you know, here's this study and here's my personal experience, and you go from there. But we're seeing a lot less of that happening. It's just become a, you know, here is what we accept, here is what is true, and you can't question it other than that. And that's a very dangerous notion being set forward, especially where we're, you know, what, 20 months now into this pandemic, and you know, you got doctors around the country of Canada being fired for speaking out, not just about vaccines, for example, but against lockdowns, right? So the College of Physicians in Ontario has suspended an ER doctor up there for speaking out about certain things, and one of them being lockdowns. And I'm thinking, Ontario locked down their province for a year, you know, like no gym for a year and no recreation essentially, and kids were terrified every single day. I mean, the silver lining argument of that science, quote unquote, would be, could we have done something a little bit better? Is there no alternative to locking down your province for a year straight? And if you're not allowed to ask that question as an ER doc and you're just fired or whatever, especially at times when, you know, the systems are overwhelmed, you hear it in the media all the time. So why are you just firing someone who has opinions? Right? That doesn't mean that she goes into work and puts people in danger, or that I would. You know, people don't like my opinions about something. And again, little disclaimer here, my opinions are simply my own. And again, I don't claim to speak for anybody else in the profession. It's just straight up what I've come to, you know, my realizations, the decisions that I've made, and certain beliefs that I have over these past 20 months that may be completely different from someone else. But you know, I don't think that warrants this kind of authoritarian, like, firing of, oh, you're speaking against lockdowns, and you know, that kind of stuff just scares me. So I guess that's just a good place to start. It's like, that's been the uphill battle that I've been treading. And you know, it seems to me anti-science when you have one group just claiming, nope, this is what it is, and we'll even fire you. And then we'll talk about how short-staffed we are, but we're still willing to fire
Let's talk
you.
about that too, right?
Yeah,
I've seen that happening.
that.
There's my friend who lives in BC, British Columbia, for all of our Americans that I know. Sometimes when I first moved here, I heard BC. I'm like, wait, are they saying DC, like Washington DC?
Oh, yeah.
So no,
Yeah.
BC. You know, there's ads on TV now for people to go and apply and become nurses, etc. And it's funny when individuals like Travis, who are simply just, as he mentioned, speaking his mind, voicing his opinions, kind of doing what science suggests, which is questioning it, is being asked to, you know, potentially step down from his job when they need help. It's like, hey, get out of here. But oh wait, can you come work all next week, by the way, too? It's really, really bizarre. And there's a few things here that you outlined already that I can't wait to dive into. But I forgot, you know, I titled the name of this episode coming into it as well as Unleash the Hounds. So by the way, like, Travis, I know you've got your data, your stats, and things that we can dive into here as well. So by all means, don't hold back. If anything, I want this interview to serve as a tool for you. If you ever get to a point where someone who is, you know, your employer or whatever, literally wants to fire you for standing up and doing what you're doing right now, I want to have it documented. Like, whoever, if that ever happens, come watch this interview and look what you just did. So we're going to unleash the hounds. And then on top of that, you know, you mentioned one thing that stood out to me. I heard this number, lockdowns in Australia, which has been known to be pretty much like the most hardcore lockdown country that is experiencing anything right now. Their homicide and crime rates are up significantly. And the funny, well, not funny, but the interesting thing about that is I remember hearing, there's this study, you've probably heard of it too, being with your background, where a bunch of civilians, normal individuals, are put, hey, there's a doggy, hey Zeus.
Hey buddy. Hey Zeus.
So let's say a group of 50 people are put in an environment where 25 are say, okay, you guys are the guards of this facility, and the other 25, you guys are the prisoners. And it's amazing how psychologically over time, even if they're all innocent people going in, the prisoners will begin to take on prisoner-like characteristics because they're being, the guards are in charge or whatever. I don't know the exact study, but I've heard that, and it seems like you have too. So it's interesting to me to see that's what we're hearing about Australia now. So
there's a mention about that. It's kind of like a power dynamic where if you're running an experiment like that, and even though people go in knowing it's an experiment, there are certain lines that people will cross based on the authority that they think they're allotted for this experiment. Like, there's another one you might have heard of. I can't remember the name of it, but basically it was a pain experiment. It's an older one, but what they would do is get a participant to sit down and they would shock an individual based on the authority figure telling them it's okay to give another shock. This is the most simplified version I can give you. But they would be able to see the reaction, and then they would have a paid actor or whatever on the other side, indicating the pain level of the shock, a tremor versus like almost a full-blown seizure where they're almost salivating in the chair. And when the experimenter, they know they're just doing an experiment, but when they tell them, yeah, that's okay, turn the volts up and do another one, they're willing to give another shock. There's this authority level to that where they think, well, I guess I'm an experiment. He wouldn't have told me to do it if he knew it wasn't safe. So this random civilian walks in, says, sure, I'll take part. And what they're actually testing is your average layperson's ability to differentiate and stop and say, you're sick, I'm not giving this next shock. Look at him. He's going to die or whatever, right? So it's that ability to differentiate where you are and critically think. Again, it's like to look at it and say, wait, you're going to turn that up again? I'm not giving that shock. I'm walking out of this study. But most people do not do that. They might be physically and mentally distressed. You can see it on their faces, but they'll still probably deliver that shock, right? So there is this dynamic going on of when you really, really hold authority figures in your environment, like in this testing scenario, again, they perceive that, well, they wouldn't have me do anything that would actually harm or put someone's life in danger. So I guess 10 more watts or whatever, and I'll give another shot, right?
10 more shots.
Yeah. And then there's another one we could just, another thing to play with is there's another experiment where they do a line experiment where they have 8 people or 10 people, but the one guy who's in there is the genuine experiment. The 7 others are paid actors. And they come in and they look at 3 lines on a piece of paper and they say, which 2 lines are the same length? And one of them is fairly obviously not the same length, but the 7 paid actors will point to that line and say it's B and C, they're the same. And then the conclusion drawn from that study is the actual experimented person, number 1, will often side with the majority rather than look at it for himself and say, you guys are crazy, this is obviously number 1, right?
Wow.
So what they see is there is a mob mentality. There is an easiness to just siding with, well, the science says, or the majority opinion is this, or all the doctors I've heard on TV have said this. So why would I listen to you running uphill, right? It's like, why would that one person in that study of 8, and he perceives the other 7 to be legitimate test subjects, and he might look at them and give them a look like, are y'all stupid? Like, how can you not see this difference? But he will still most times pick the line that is completely wrong because the other 7 chose it.
Wow. So that unpacks a lot of things for me there as well. I might have even shared this last time I had you on, but I heard a quote from I'd say an acquaintance of mine. I've had him on the show before. His name is G. Edward Griffin. He wrote the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Highly encourage everyone listening tuned in to check that book out as well. Serious red pill type of book. Definitely something that got me questioning a lot, including things like the Fed, IRS, all that. We'll save that for another conversation, but that is a powerful book. Creature from Jekyll Island. Highly recommend it. But so I've had G. Edward Griffin on the show before, and he talked about I think it was Samuel Adams, which if you think back to the beginning, the foundational aspects of the US, America, a lot of the reason that those individuals left Europe and went came across the Atlantic Ocean, which was pretty gutsy if you just think about it back in the day, to go create a better life for themselves where they didn't have to report to an authority. I do believe, and you've probably seen it, Travis, I think we talked about it too, is like that underlying like FU mentality that America was built on has kind of transpired a little bit into right now. And I'm grateful for that, to say, you know, I am proud to be an American for that reason. And I hope that we can bring some more influence to Canada, because you've got the Newfoundland blood, which is a little bit of the same spirit. It's not like, it's not a true, in my opinion, a true Canadian province. Like there's a little bit of like a freedom fighter in there. So anyways, before I get off track,
they got their own heart.
what I'm getting at is, I remember G. Edward Griffin saying that Samuel Adams once had a theory or some type of notion where if 14% of a population, and so that's clearly a minority, if 14% of a population is thinking in the direction of how they would like things to go, that's enough to influence the remainder of the population. Because you're never going to have normally a situation where the majority is, well, if the majority is all probably on the same page, that might be a dangerous thing too. That's the power of the minority. The one person out of the however many that would say, no, that line is smaller. That's the Travis. Hopefully I'd like to say that's the Adam, you know, those are the ones. So, any thoughts on that?
I agree. I would like to think that I'm that person, that when I'm there, I think it comes back to just really being comfortable and okay with the consequences, like the individual responsibility of, taking the consequences of your actions. And if that in that study means that you're that one person who's like, you guys are crazy, I'm seeing something completely different, I'm going with number one, and everybody else picked, number 2 and 3 are the same length, then, it's still having that conviction. Like, I'm not going to be swayed because a bunch of people next to me, especially strangers that I don't know, all agree on one thing, and that's what's happening right now, is that I don't care that 8 out of 10 people in the room look at me and say, like, I don't know, man, this is, I'm just going to listen to this expert or whatever. And I'll be like, most times too, if you ask those people, well, what have you looked at outside of this? Like, what research or what other figures have you listened to? Any of the doctors currently being censored? Have you sat down and listened to a 3-hour podcast of 3 of the most censored people in the world talking, and why they would say what they have to say? Because I have, and I've done multiple, things like that. And I'm always listening to podcasts. So I'm happy to be on one. But, it's just, you ask these people and they're like, no. Well, I've watched this and I listened to this person on the news say this. And that's about the extent of it. And they have a general knowledge base. And, they criticize me sometimes for my nursing knowledge base, to say, how can you be going against the grain? And I'm like, you don't understand that what I do comes with no reward. Like, for people like me who are speaking out and taking all the criticism and the heat, it comes with so much risk and it comes with so much criticism. But what I'm finding is there is more and more appreciation and love for that, because people want to hear 2 sides of a coin. They don't want to just be told that the coin is heads and don't look under the tail. Like, don't look, on the other side. I want to see it for myself and then I'll decide. Right. And I think more people need to do that. Again, it's personal accountability. And again, if I were to bring things up and someone else finds a different source and comes to the conclusion, like, no, you're actually nuts and I don't agree with any of that, then that's fine. That's the nature of the beast. That's to me, that's science. Right. So I think we need to get back to more of that, where if it's only 14% of the population, you still have that conviction that you read something and you believe something for certain reasons. And if it's a strongly held belief, then, damn well I'm going to hold it. Right. Like, I'm not just going to crumble. Right. I'm going to be that guy who's like throwing the stone at the glass house. Right. Or, even if it's a solid house and I feel like I've got no hope, I'm just going to still throw it out there into the world. And if that's my opinion being bounced around in the world and 9 out of 10 people disagree with me, it's cool. It's fine. It shouldn't demonize the other side of an argument to think like, well, we don't need to hear this guy, or this person needs to be censored, or that ER doc needs to be fired. Right. That's where we get into shaky territory. And, it's easy to cave when you're only 14% of the population or whatever, right? So, right now in our province, we're reaching 90+% vaccinated. And, there is a fine line, because I will tell people I'm not just an anti-vaxxer. That's a broad smear statement. So again, if people in the future are to want to know more of my opinions, they look back to this, like, full on, I'm just an anti-mandate person. Like, I'm a personal accountability, risk benefit ratio, give me all that stuff and let me make my own decisions. Right. So when I'm out at these rallies and stuff like that, like we have more at the Confederation building and stuff now, it's just purely mandate. You're not going to see many anti-vax people. It's not about that. It's about I should have a choice. You know what I mean? And for health officials to get on the air and say that there's no risk is essentially it's just false. You cannot claim there is no risk anymore. There is enough anecdotal evidence, plus you have your databases that people will try to discredit, like VIRS and stuff like that, right? So it's just false for them to say that there's no risk, just take it. You shouldn't even think twice, and you have to. Like that's the other point, right? It's like, do this or you're fired, is where the red flags are waving for me, and then that just makes me want to dig my heels in. I don't like that, right?
Exactly. Because if you peel it a step back, it's not much further away from do this or else we'll shoot you. right? Like, it's still the same.
Yeah, well, I mean, what else would it take? It's like, okay, now my recreation or whatever I love to do, plus my job, plus I can never fly, I can't travel. Like, when is it going to be you can't drive to the next city? Or like, the thing is, it's such incremental progress, or I should say regression, because we're taking away from people and their civil liberties in the name of freedom for this thing that I don't think has been justified, right? Like, I don't know if you want to go into this, but in our province right now, we've got a movement and a bunch of people that are filing criminal charges of extortion against government and health officials. So this has become a very, contingent point of controversy, because they're claiming, that there are grounds for extortion. Because what would need to happen is, if there was an investigation, everything would need to be on the table. And in doing so, they would need to prove that we are in a drastic state of emergency to justify these measures that are things that were denounced years before, because it impacts civil liberties. It destroys your ability to choose. Like, someone is to tell me nowadays, the argument, well, you still have a choice. They're not coming to your door and tying you down and injecting you. I'm like, yeah, but they're taking my job and all the things that I love, and they're telling me I can't go to public spaces, and some places you can't visit a loved one in hospital. So I still have a choice, but if my mother has a heart attack, I can't go visit her in a hospital. Like, so there's a fine line between that, right? So it's more or less extorting or coercing the public into having to do something that it has to incur some risk. Nearly every medicine in the world does, regardless of going into the vaccine stats themselves. So it does incur some risk, but you're not giving people the full opportunity to, face that themselves and say, you know what, I'm a 27-year-old and I'm pretty healthy. I take care of myself. I'm not personally worried. I would never go anywhere if I knew I was sick or symptomatic. Everybody else has had the choice to get, or the chance to get vaccinated, so they're protected, right? When you go through these arguments, it becomes a circular model. I've had arguments with people where, they say that I should not be allowed in a restaurant if I was unvaccinated. And then I say, why? Because you mean if you're in there, it's too unsafe for me to be there. And they'll say something like, well, yeah, because you're unvaccinated, you could spread it. And I'll be like, but if there's a vax pass, then you're vaccinated. Me walking in as an unvaccinated person suddenly puts you in more danger, but you've had the protection, right? So there's obviously flaws in the argument. And then the other problem is, you look at the civil liberty side of it, we're not letting people choose. Plus, there's so many flaws in the actual efficacy, like our breakthrough case rates and things like that now. Like, a few weeks ago, the 2-week Ontario data was showing that 35.6% of all new cases in Ontario were double vaccinated.
Yep.
Right. And then the other problem with that is you're going to see a manipulation of words and data points. So you're going to see the other side of that coin is people using numbers and then using the phrase not fully vaccinated, which is different than saying there was 70% cases in the unvaccinated, because not fully vaccinated means that you've either got one dose or you're 2 weeks out, anywhere in between that process of getting your second dose and 2 weeks post second dose. So when someone says in the not fully vaccinated, that includes 3 categories versus just saying the unvaccinated. So you might have had your Pfizer shot, 3 days later, you get COVID, you're considered not fully vaccinated, right? So there's also this semantic game that we're playing and this word play to manipulate statistics and fear in people. And unless you're really aware of that, you're not going to pick up on these subtle cues. Be like, wait, you didn't say unvaccinated, you said not fully vaccinated. That changes the entire landscape, because for a while in Ontario, we were seeing a lot of cases in people that only had their first dose, because it doesn't offer near as much protection, of course. So again, just to kind of wrap that up into the civil liberties argument of making your own decisions, the problem is, even furthermore, when you have public health officials and all these politicians that have made statements in their past that you can dig up and read them out, and in stark contrast of this year and last year, it's like night and day. It's like you really just flip-flop like that, and we have electronic records to show that you said this, and now it's suddenly fine with you, right? Like I want to read you a quote from our John Hagee.
Please. Oh yeah, please do.
Public health officer. So this is from 2002. John Hagee said this, and I want you to think about this in the context of December 17th, I believe it is apparently our date that the unvaccinated will be fired, right, in our province. Now, our registered nurses union is actually rallying for short staffing crises, saying that we are now, without this implementation, we are in a crisis mode, and that is true. We are short staffed, and now, I mean, that's not getting into this whole electronic system crash. That's a whole
right.
other thing.
Actually, so that is that is significant breaking news that most of the world is not going to know about. That's a Newfoundland thing. So I don't know if we can make a note to circle back to that, because that's a teaser for the world.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. So
I'm gonna make a note. I guess keep going with what you're doing.
Okay, so yeah, we'll come back to that. But on top of the issues that, okay, so number one issue, we've got a staffing crisis in our healthcare system, could be better. We've had a pre-existing hospital problem. I'll give you an example. 5 out of 6 PICU beds, which are pediatric intensive care unit beds, recently were occupied, so that they started shipping a couple of them to Halifax, because if there were any more came in, or if there was some accident or something, we wouldn't have had capacity to care for those babies or those young children or whatever. Now, you think about that, 5 out of 6 beds for the whole province. Now, I looked at the COVID stats that day. There was a fear-mongering headline that just spoke about overcapacity PICU beds, but it had nothing to do with COVID, and they did not specify that. But you looked at the COVID stats that day, there was 1 person in total in all of Newfoundland in the hospital with COVID. 1. Our hospitals are not overwhelmed with COVID. They never have, and probably won't.
What you did was you were the one person that said, no, wait, the line is shorter. This is the shorter line.
Yeah.
Based on that experiment.
Yeah. I'm like, what is up with that shorter line? And why the hell are people just clicking on this headline and seeing the longer lines and being like, okay, that's what it is. So I went and looked, and that 1 person in hospital, it didn't specify if it was pediatric or not, but I'm assuming 5 out of 6 of those young children in hospital were not there for COVID, but the headline didn't specify, the article didn't really make that mention, right? So it makes people think, holy shit, our children are overwhelmed. We must go get our children vaccinated. So anyway, long story short, it's absurd that you only have 6 beds in the whole province for these children, right? So that's how easily you can get overwhelmed. That's when there's essentially no pandemic there for those kids, because none of them were hospitalized in the ICU due to COVID, right? So we send kids to Halifax in Newfoundland based on no pandemic affecting them at that moment. That's how easily we get over capacity, right? So similarly true for our other healthcare systems, our acute care beds. We're regularly putting people in off-service locations. You know, they might have had orthopedic surgery, but they wind up on a different unit because everything is full, right? So we're often doing this. We often have most of our beds are full. And then I'm seeing the backlog of people trying to get into long-term care because we have an aging population, right? We're getting an aging
Right.
population that's getting sicker and sicker. So long story short there, our system is aging and our system has not been revamped and you know, given the power it needs to handle everyday life without a pandemic. And then you put a pandemic in there, even if it means one new person's in hospital, you can still claim the system is overwhelmed because it has been for years. Right? The PICU system had nothing to do with COVID, but it was overwhelmed. So I want to point that out. And then the number two thing there is that we're looking at potentially firing unvaccinated healthcare professionals who are capable and willing to do the job. Where I work, we have not had one single COVID case. So we've successfully prevented that with our measures. And again, some of that involves finding a silver lining. But we've successfully done that. But essentially in December, it's going to be implied that it's too unsafe to have an unvaccinated nurse in that same facility that has had zero COVID cases since the beginning, right? So until that happens, how can you justify firing that person? Anyway, tying all this back to Dr. John Hagee, here's his statement from 2000. Here's his statement from 2002. When he was a president of the Newfoundland and Labrador Medical Association. Now you'll see him doing these pressers and, you know, answering questions about the pandemic. So anyway, he said, the system in this province has eroded to a point where we are one doctor short of closing down even essential services. This was 2002.
20 years
and
ago.
And if you really hone in on the specific language, we are one doctor short. But now in 2021, that same person and the same establishment would be fine with firing even just one doctor or one nurse like myself because I've got a different point of view on something. Even though I'm not actually impacting our numbers, my different point of view doesn't cause 50 new COVID cases every day. It's just simply, it's an authoritarian level kind of boot on the neck of free speech. And also your ability to question science. And even if you bring forth evidence, it's like it doesn't matter. There's an accepted line of thinking. There is the 7 of the 8 that are choosing B and C. And if you choose A, then too bad for you. We're going to fire you. And we're still going to release media articles about how we're overwhelmed daily. And you're going to have these hypocritical statements from these health officials. Again, this is where this criminal charge comes into play about the extortion. It's like, show me where we are so different now than where we were 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago in our healthcare system. How are we so much more overwhelmed that you can justify a segregationist vaccine passport? How can you justify that in the same gym that I go to that's, so far as I know, had zero COVID cases related? I've never seen that we've had to contact trace from the gym that I go to for now 20 months during the pandemic, that it's suddenly so unsafe that everybody's got to scan in and you're in a fully vaccinated environment and you're still wearing the mask.
Well, that's the other thing now too is and
right.
I have a friend who who's, as you would say, like fully vaccinated or whatever. He said he had to go to BC, British Columbia. We're gonna keep going the Canadian direction here today, guys. So he was going to visit his father or family, and he had to reschedule his flight multiple times because he got what they call the false positive. And it was really interesting to me how because he's documented as vaccinated, they didn't treat him like, oh my God, this guy's dangerous, like get him down, like get him quarantined, whatever. It's like, oh, well, you've already got your shot, it's a false positive, just come back next week, we'll get you a negative. Like, which he's still upset because he had to like reschedule his flight and stuff. But it's super it's like I'm looking at these 3 lines and someone's telling me which one's the shortest one, and it's like clearly there's something going on here. And then my buddy who do a Newfoundland reference as well too, he's getting into acting here, and he'll remain unnamed, but He's cracking up, and he's actually really frustrated because him and everyone else on set, in order to be on set, you got to show your papers.
Yeah.
How communist Russia does that sound? You got to show your papers to
Yeah.
be on set.
Yeah.
And actually, Russia is a country that's kind of saying we're not buying into this right now. Shout out to Russia.
Yeah. They're not doing it. It's like,
So you got to show your papers to be on set, and then they literally have someone hired on set whose job it is to go around and tell people who aren't like on camera to pull their mask back up when
oh,
everyone's
God.
already. That's when it's like, is anyone else paying attention to how insane this is right now?
Right.
So,
Or even if it's just below your nose, like your nasal breathing is just going to cause a fucking outbreak.
Right. And a shout out to in my opinion, Montreal is kind of weird, but getting back into Canada, I was cracking up because I heard all these horror stories of Toronto and BC. And I think because I came back in through Montreal, like that's the move for all of my freedom fighting foreigners. If you do want to come to Canada, go through Montreal, because the customs guy actually had his mask below his nose. I'm like, oh, this is my guy right here.
Try.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's how divided we are, right? And how noticeable it is. And you've referenced BC multiple times, and I just so happen to have some BC government stats here. So I figured I'd throw this out there as well. We got a couple other things I want to mention, but yeah, I figured I'd throw this out there. So in terms of the whole, children and vaccinating children. So in terms of 12 to 7-year-olds with COVID in BC, total cases and hospitalizations, the rate of hospitalization ever, that means anyone diagnosed, which would be 11,797 cases in 12 to 17-year-olds, 46 of them only ever required hospitalization, which would be 0.39%. Now, the problem is that if you were to look at some polls, especially in the States, they did specific polls asking people, what percentage of COVID cases do you think actually require hospitalization? And I mean, some of the answers are upwards of 10, 20, 30%, right? That 1 in 3 people who gets COVID needs to be hospitalized, which is just an absurd overstatement. So it shows you the impact of the fear and this almost like delusional kind of hypochondria that we've had. Not saying it's not dangerous. That disclaimer is out there, especially if you're older, especially if you've got comorbidities, even if you are 14, like something like being a type 1 diabetic and those kind of things, or if you're obese, that's going to put you at more risk. But I mean, general numbers, it's shocking to me how people don't draw these conclusions. Again, in let's see, ages 11 and under, 17,838 cases in total. Only 0.89% of them were ever hospitalized. There was 158, only 2 deaths. So in British Columbia, there's only 2 documented deaths that are under age 11. Again, you would need to know the full story of that, because oftentimes we're not seeing death specifically just from COVID. There may be other complications. It could have been, an infant that had another issue, right?
I want to interject real here with the hospitalization concept and how certainly going to the hospital in certain situations is going to potentially save someone's life. We'll put it that way.
Of course.
But I just watched a video and I put it in the comments here on Facebook, and Courtney, whoever, Courtney, as you're doing the show notes, be sure to include this link. But there's a story on how the Amish, the Mennonite community in the US in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, when COVID first hit, which was like spring 2020, in a nutshell, the whole community got it. They all recovered from it, and they had, herd immunity by May 2020 and got back to business as usual. And that's because the Amish, they don't go with they don't go with our educational system. They don't really believe in the hospital, like anything that's traditionally something us, North Americans would do or believe in. That's not really their style. And it's really cool to see how people who have been born into this culture that wants pretty much nothing to do with the government and has religious exemptions or whatever, powered through in like 3 months, something that we're extending out intentionally right now. So you were talking about hospitalization rates, and I just remember hearing none of the Amish people, hardly any of them went to a hospital intentionally.
Right.
And they're sick, they want to be with family,
Yeah. And then there's other points that can be made about that, is that we've hardly heard anything from our health officials about how to reduce your severity of illness other than vaccine, mask, sanitizer, distancing. Okay, you can say all that, but why are you not talking about the other things, right? Why are you not talking about the importance of vitamin D? I mean, I'm looking at a study here from, it's on PubMed. You can look it up. It's from 2021, new study. COVID-19 mortality risk correlates inversely with vitamin D3 status, and a mortality rate close to zero could theoretically be reached by achieving a certain concentration of vitamin D3. So what we've seen too in certain other studies, I've seen that 90+% of people that had the worst outcomes of COVID, regardless of comorbidities, also often correlated with low vitamin D. So we're not talking just like go outside and get a little bit of sun every day. We're saying get as much sun as you can, also supplement. And there's, you could take several thousand IUs, units of vitamin D3 a day, right? It's super cheap over the counter supplement. Yep. And it's just one little thing you could do, right? Again, not giving any specific medical advice to anybody, but just look into it yourself. It's a cheap supplement. You can buy it at a Pharma Choice or anything like that, right? Mm-hmm. And then also, why are we not talking about, sleep, stress, importance of certain types of food, and, all the other things you can do to improve your system? Right.
We might as well. I just realized we might as well just get this on record too. And I don't know if I shared it with you, but like when I had my recent trip to the US, I got COVID, and thankfully I had access to hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin. Oh man, I didn't turn into a horse, guys. And guess what? I was better I mean, I got really bad for probably about 2 or 3 days, but I recovered very quickly. And trust me, I got the symptoms, but I can tell you this right now, it feels good to say, especially documented on paper, because I got an antibody test. It feels good to say that I am naturally immune. And
right.
I'm a healthy guy, whatever, but like, sorry, go ahead.
That needs to be acknowledged more. Is just what I wanted to say. Like that you should be able to show those papers and be like, I'm like alpha immune. Like, don't give me that vaccine. Oh, a vaccine is equivalent to natural immunity. No. There's so many studies on that. They might be able to point to a few that are really cherry picked, but we've seen even experts talking about waning vaccine immunity that lowers over time. Mm-hmm. So the booster is just an increase in your antibody titers. It's not actually formulated for the Delta variant. So hypothetically, what you're going to see is a third booster is just going to boost antibody levels for another 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 months, and then they start dropping off again. And then maybe the fourth shot, they decide to make a Delta specific vaccine. And then what you're going to, hypothetically, I'm just saying this right now, this is my belief, and based on other experts I've listened to, people really need to go and listen to Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Geert Vanden Bosch when they talk about this stuff. They really know their shit.
Please get that in the show notes, Courtney.
Yeah. And Geert Vanden Bosch, bit of a funny spelling, but you'll find him if you search him up. You'll probably initially find articles about how he's been fact-checked and smeared and whatever. But go listen to a long-form interview of him speaking about what he predicted before the vaccines were even rolled out about the potential of variants and antibody-dependent enhancement. So those are two things to look up. And then also, Geert talks about, if you're vaccinating en masse during a pandemic, during a wave of a pandemic, what you're going to breed essentially, or breed the desire for the virus to do, is to mutate, because you're suddenly putting all these people around the virus that it hypothetically can't access very well, right? They have some degree of immunity. So the virus is put in this position of survival mode, where what else is it going to do? It's going to mutate into a more infectious strain. So that's typically what we've seen with the Delta variant, but usually that means a more infectious strain is usually less deadly, which is good. And also, if the vaccines are reducing mortality, that's good too. But that's why we're seeing all these breakthrough cases. And if you start to vaccinate for Delta specifically, you will have the next wave of Delta will just be a different variant that is mutating to avoid that vaccine immunity. These SARS coronaviruses are easily mutating to battle, like their spike protein that they're immune to when you're injected with the first vaccine is hypothetically it's like alpha COVID, right? But when a Delta variant comes along, it's already bypassing immunity to some degree. And then also you've got the problem that if you had your second shot 6 months ago, there's a infectious disease expert here in the province at MUN, Dr. Russell, who said that your immunity is waning. So now we've got the case set for boosters so that at a certain point, your Vax Pass doesn't scan anymore unless you've had the third. And then when they decide the fourth. And this is the precedent being set moving forward that is so dangerous and that people just don't understand the scope of. Because then essentially it's government sanctioned access to everything based on what you inject into your body and how many times and when. I mean, the fact that people don't understand the scope of that.
Yeah. And there's like so many things that, again, if you read between the lines, are so obvious that we're just being, for the most part, as a majority, being treated as if we are really dumb. And one thing that blows my mind is I can't tell you how many freaking PCR swabs and all that stuff I had to put in my nose, which I didn't even like doing that, but without going into details there. If you look at the packaging, like I encourage everyone listening, it's not everyone. I've noticed it's not every single packaging, but the little packages that those things come in literally say like Wuhan, China on it.
Yeah.
So if you don't think something weird is going on right now, please, I encourage you to just question a little bit because speaking of speaking of that, a friend of mine who is from China, he lives in LA, was telling me about how their media is just like, how our media is, wow, China's the worst place ever, it's terrible, blah, blah, all these bad things are happening, they're the reason we have the virus. He said that their media, the narrative, and again, this is just what I've heard, the narrative there is that the US military is the one that infected their country with the virus. So we all think it's them. They all think it's us in a nutshell. And meanwhile, can we just have some freedom? That's freedom of choice.
I mean, on that note, there was one other point I wanted to make actually is from the same, another quote from Dr. Hagee. So I'd like to circle back and give that because you brought up the freedom piece. And I don't know if you've seen this document. This is not from Hagee, but this was Canadian National Report on Immunization 1996. So this is on the Public Health Agency of Canada website, where in immunization in Canada, the very beginning says, unlike some countries, immunization is not mandatory in Canada. It cannot be made mandatory because of the Canadian Constitution.
Wow.
Right there on government website. And that's why you have people fighting this so hard. But you've got the 80 or 70, 80, 90% of people who are just so convicted in like, this is the new normal, that we don't care about all these, foundational principles. We'll throw them to the wind for this one virus.
That makes a lot of sense because as much as it seemed like you have to get that to be here, I know I was able to enter in unvaccinated because there was something that said that it's like, this does not stop. This is not a determining factor for you entering. And you just
if you know your laws and you know what to argue and when, the thing is they'll take advantage, and even a police officer will just claim like I'm following the rules, like at a very surface level, and someone who doesn't understand any of the laws and the sanctions and this and that and section blah 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 this and says I can't do this and you can't do this to me, like they don't have anything to say in the face of that. For example, one little story here, my friend was in a Starbucks recently, unvaccinated in the Starbucks. He got his coffee, that was fine, but then he went to sit down on his laptop, so they had to ask him like, do you have your Vax Pass? And he said no, like basically told him I'm unvaccinated and I'm going to sit here. And they're like, no, you can't, I mean, you're going to put everybody at risk, blah, blah, blah. They argued with him. Long story short, the person at Starbucks was so inclined to say, well, we're going to call the police on you. And he said, that's fine, go ahead and do it. So they did. And my buddy messages me telling me that, there was 4 cop cars and 5 police officers that showed up to talk to him. And he just held his ground and like had to go outside and speak to them about and showed them what sections and what laws in the Canadian Charter and how like there was loopholes that they were trying to argue. And then he had a loophole to go back to say like, different reasons why this cannot be infringed upon and blah, blah, blah. And finally, the sergeant said, like, basically he respected his kind of conviction and his stance and digging his heels in, and he didn't have to leave.
Wow.
But it was an ordeal. I mean, you have to go out of your way.
I think Canadians need to hear that, because
Yeah,
it seems it really the public narrative is hopeless, in my opinion. So that's
right. They
a story
make
that
it
needs to be
seem
heard.
like, oh my God, I'm getting a $2,000 fine, and I might even be dragged out of the place, and plus the embarrassment and the confrontation. I mean, my friend is not a confrontational person, but when his principles are at question and he knows he's on the right side of the law, whatever, call the cops. Like, and you imagine too, driving past that Starbucks, you see 4 police officers, like, or 5 officers and 4 cruisers.
Got nothing else to do. Everyone's sitting at home now.
Right? And you just think the place is being robbed at gunpoint, and it's some dude in there who doesn't have a vaccine trying to sit down for a coffee. Like, he can walk in and order it and walk back out takeout, but he can't sit at a table and drink it and browse on his computer.
I want to know how the danger level of the virus goes down when you're sitting too. I still haven't figured that out.
Right. Well, I guess at that point he was going to take his mask off, which is, I mean, just the worst kind of biohazard weapon available, is to just dispense of the mask if you're unvaccinated. So it's just absurd to me anyway, that this guy, again, it's absurd that he would hold so hard, and I'm so proud that he did. Right. And didn't publicize it. He wasn't trying to make some big recording and go live. And I mean, if he did, he probably would have got a lot of traction.
For the benefit of our listeners, where can they go see this specific clause or whatever it may be, just to, empower themselves?
So basically, it's Canadian Charter. I would say that even just this statement from the Canadian National Report on Immunization, you can look that up. It's 1996 Public Health Agency of Canada website. I mean, right there alone, it says they are not to be made mandatory in Canada. But then you get into the weeds of this argument of businesses being able to do what they want to do to protect their patrons and their staff, right? Mm-hmm. And then you're more or less just into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So what it came down to was argument about certain wordings. And the way that it's worded is so that you can't really challenge it too much. You can get into the weeds about, like, religious exemptions and this and that, but then there's even parts about infringing on someone's or causing psychological distress to someone because of your actions, and these were things that were referenced. I would have to ask him for the specific portions and like what documents he cited, but having his laptop there, he was literally, and he knows it anyway, but able to cite things back to them that the officers, they don't know it inside and out. It's, you don't automatically remember this shit all day, every day. So they're kind of stumped and saying, well, listen, I'm just kind of trying to follow the orders here. And right. So he was able to work around it to say, like, this is discrimination. And in the end, didn't have to kind of do anything differently. Right. Yep. No charges laid. And it was apparently like a 50-minute ordeal. Like this is where we've come. Like, unvaccinated sitting down for a coffee turns into a 50-minute confrontation with 5 police officers. It's not just one dispatch, right? So
call the boys. We got a bandit over here.
On that note, there's one other quote here that I wanted to reference, because this is not necessarily law, but it just shows you the hypocrisy of these officials and some of the things that they will say just 3 years ago. So back in 2018, again, Dr. John Hagee says the government cannot force people to get vaccinated out of respect for individual freedoms enshrined in the Charter of Rights, regardless of how beneficial vaccines are to public health. Now, he made these statements because 2018 was a particularly bad flu season for Newfoundland. We lost more people in that one flu year than we've lost in 20 months of COVID, right? And people don't realize that. They don't put it into context, and I'll share some of those stats now in a second. Mm-hmm. But Hagee went on to say, if you look at what we have now, it would not pass a charter challenge. You could drive a bus through it. AKA saying the legality of implementing total mandated vaccines is so loose you could drive a bus through it. That bit is all designed to balance the needs to society as a whole and its protection and the rights of the individual. It passes a reasonable legal test at the moment of protecting the individual's rights and providing them with routes of appeal, mandatory review, or orders and protection of the law. So in 2018, Hagee was an advocate that you still had your bodily autonomy, you still had your rights to say no to what is injected into your body, and to not have some 21-year-old person on a door telling you that if you don't scan your pass, sorry, I'm just following orders, you have to leave or I'm going to call the cops. Right? So this was just 3 years ago. Like, people don't get this. And I think what people can also do and look it up and just put it in contrast to what's happening right now. There's a phrase, and I don't know if I said this in our last episode. It's called the Overton window. The Overton window is basically like, it's a metered gauge of, your policies that become acceptable over time. It's usually incremental. So let's say on one end of the spectrum, you've got civil liberties, and then on the other side, you've got safety. So it's that silver lining that where does your meter go, where you say, I don't need you to completely control all aspects of my life for my safety. I'll take some more of my civil liberties, please. And if you're to look at someone like me right now, I sit way closer to the civil liberties end of the spectrum, pretty far up there, because again, I believe in personal accountability for my own safety. If there's things I can do for my own health, I'll do them for my own safety. Right? You don't need to mandate anything, even a mask for me. I'm going to do what's right for me. Mm-hmm. So again, this Overton window is a good way to look at how societies can just completely shift in a matter of a couple of years. And the Overton window, the one thing that pressures that and influences it to shift the fastest and the most efficiently is fear, of course. So when you're in a pandemic, the Overton window shifts to like, oh my God, government, give me safety, whatever you need to do. And some people don't recover from that. They don't shift their meter back down 20 months later when everybody's vaccinated. They're still acting as if we're like in the dire straits of a fourth wave and nobody's vaccinated and there's hospitals overwhelmed, because they still read it every day, right? They don't critically think and analyze it. So just on that note, another quick point here with some stats. My friend put this together from government data. So there were 1,033 laboratory confirmed cases of influenza during that 2018-2019 season. Of those cases, 1,033, again, Newfoundland, we're not very much farther than that in COVID cases. There were 270 hospitalizations. This is just the flu, 63 ICU admissions, and 27 influenza-related deaths. We're currently at, I believe, 16 or 17 COVID deaths. So this is in 2018, there were 27 confirmed influenza deaths, multiple ICU admissions. So the point being that this would have been about one death every 2 weeks. There was not a mass to be seen. There were no lockdowns, no restrictions. No one lost their job over vaccination statuses. No one had a QR code telling you that you couldn't go into a gym that has not even had a single COVID case. Right. And then you get your premier, Andrew Fury, not only just, making matters worse, but he goes on and says that this is a behavior modification tool. That's a direct quote from him when he was asked by a reporter, how much of this is purely public safety in terms of the passport, not being able to go to a gym? How much of that is purely safety? And how much of it is just to increase your vaccination numbers and you're incentivizing through coercion and extortion? But he admitted it is both. It is partially public safety, and then it is also a behavioral modification tool. That's exactly what he called it. That's our premier, our liberal premier of Newfoundland. So anyway, that just sparks some more controversy
it's crazy
there.
How it's laid out in plain sight.
Right. And now people are starting to see that. And when they make statements like that, I mean, how can you not just go like, what gives you the right to say that? What gives you the right to say that you are in any position to modify?
If I'm not mistaken, isn't his background in medicine too?
Yeah, he's a doctor.
Yeah.
Right. So, and he's, again, the the disingenuous side of that, because what he's saying is actually true. It's just, it's shocking sometimes to see when they're actually completely honest, because they're so brave and confident to come out and just say things the way they are. Oh, we're modifying your behavior. This is an incentive tool, right? Like, if you don't take it and you can't go to your gym and that's something you love to do and it's good for your health, then we're going to do it, and it's worth it because it might incentivize you to be coerced, because that's not a free choice anymore. You're losing things, you're being restricted. So then you go make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, I can't tell you, man, I've had like 5, 6, 7 different people messaging me in the last couple months with all these coercive mandates and passports, telling me I just booked my appointment, or I'm currently sitting in the public health chair about to be injected, and they're calling me crying. Or I've had people tell me, I'm so ashamed, I didn't want to tell you that I caved in and got it. I'm ashamed of myself. Or I did this because I don't know how I'm going to feed my daughter otherwise. How many people have told me I did it because I wanted it and I wanted to protect myself and my family? Again, we know breakthrough cases happen. So that notion is gone, right? You don't just simply take it yourself to save grandma's life. You can still give it to grandma. And in fact, the public health messaging that you cannot transmit it, that's what it seems to be, take it to protect everybody else, is disingenuous to the point that it actually puts people in more danger. Because like you said about the travel, if you're fully vaccinated and you fly and land somewhere, you don't have the quarantine for 10 days or whatever. You go out to a pub that night, and then you go to a movie the next day in a restaurant, and then on day 3 you test positive. Guess what? You just infected a whole portion of the population, because you have
a false positive. It's a false positive.
right. But being like, you have a false sense of security and you don't have to be restricted. So then even if you have no symptoms, you go out and you do your business, and the unvaccinated person with no symptoms has to lock themselves away. Right. So again, just food for thought on the whole influenza note is that personally here in this province, we were averaging a death every 2 weeks. We had 63 ICU admissions, 27 deaths in 1 year. And our flu vaccine numbers, although there were a few media articles about it, there was never a hard push. And we were at about 20 to 30% of the population had taken it.
And I'd say that's probably you could probably compare those numbers, relatively speaking, to many other parts of the world, and Newfoundland happens to just be a great sample size for something like this. And
exactly.
We got to wrap it up here, but I've got so many notes on things I wanted to touch on. So who knows? Maybe we'll do a part 3.
Right.
The only other thing I want to highlight here is, one, I always like to use this analogy, which is from the world of science, and you referred to it as a religion. I actually have a t-shirt in the comments on Facebook. If you guys want to check it out, it literally says science is religion. And I made that shirt like 3 or 4 years ago, because I'm like, people worship science as if it's all true. They worship it as if it's God or Jesus or Muhammad, like all hail science. And so look at I think it's like the 1970s. I don't know how many elements were in the periodic table of elements, but I'm sure in the 70s, they were like, this is all there is. These are all the elements in the world that will ever exist. And now there's a lot more. I know that now.
Right.
So science is always changing. We always think we're so smart right now, but I guarantee 50 years from now, we'll go, wow, we were pretty stupid back then. So I say all that to also, if you could just briefly talk about the Newfoundland health crisis, because that is something that could happen in other parts of the world as far as personal information. And I think that's the direction. That's the main reason for a lot of this, is control and personal information getting to the government's hands. And now we've seen here as a sample size how that can go wrong. So
I'm glad you brought that up. We got time to squeeze that in, because really, like, this is all a lot of opinion based stuff that we're talking about, and it's good. I love that stuff. But this one here, this is just shocking. So basically what has happened is that on this past Saturday, which would have been October 30th. So October 30th, we basically had our whole Meditech healthcare system go down and be inaccessible. So that means Meditech, where I chart for long-term care, every note I've written, all the charting ticks I've done, if someone's ate that day and blah, 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 all the lab works, all the CT scans of previous years, whatever
If
you can
someone's
think
gone to
of.
therapy for like psychological
Yep.
counseling, right? Yep.
And all their notes on the topics, the disciplinary notes of multiple different professionals, everything that has been computerized is completely inaccessible throughout all regions of our healthcare system. So not just Eastern Health targeted, it's like Central, Western, Labrador. Apparently Western is less somehow, but basically our province has taken this one targeted electronic hit. And originally Saturday, people just didn't have answers. We were told there was going to be a presser on Monday in which Dr. Haggie was on that presser with Dave Diamond, who's like the director. And they had very vague bureaucratic answers, right? So at one point, Dave Diamond said, 1 to 2 to 3 days, hopefully we'll start figuring this out and get it resolved. They asked Haggie because there was a CBC article claiming it had been a ransomware attack. So basically, a hacker or a group or some malicious spyware has infiltrated our system, and we no longer have access. Not only that, but someone else may be able to access every single person's medical records in this whole province. And our healthcare professionals as a whole are now paper charting and cannot get in to see a lab work from 10 years ago or a chest x-ray or whatever. So we send stuff to the lab. They have to call us. Like there's, basically the grid is down. And he had no answers. Again, just very vague answers. We're still in investigations and it's speculative. And then the very next day, there's a CBC article from an IT expert who was claiming that the system essentially may need to be rebuilt. And he was using language, along the lines implying that our backup locally and provincially may be inaccessible. And whether or not it's a ransom or not is still unknown. So someone could be hanging a price tag over the government's head for their own medical system, or it's completely wiped or just so infected with some spyware or whatever that we can't use it, that now they're claiming it could last weeks or months. So Monday, Dave Diamond said that the implication of that in his roughest estimate was that just Monday alone, there would have been thousands of routine testing and procedures and appointments that would have been canceled. There are multiple hundreds of people across the province receiving chemotherapy that on Monday could not even go to their chemo appointment.
Wow.
And now he said again, this hopeful notion, 1 to 2 to 3 days. One day later, we're told this could last weeks and months, and we may need to completely rebuild our system, and we may never get our old stuff back.
Wow.
That even includes our emails. So that's all professional healthcare emails. Every manager and every staff member, we're not able to use our emails to get our staffing lists or to email some other therapist to say, hey, can you look at this person or whatever? All of that plus medical records are currently down. And I'm just speculating. I don't have all the answers, but from the information out there right now, we literally don't know. And that could last weeks or months. And in one day, he confirmed that there was thousands of cancellations. So we cannot live like that. That's for certain.
Whether you could say whether honestly this was something done by the good guys or the bad guys. I think the really big picture takeaway here is during a time where the medical industry, we'll say here in Newfoundland, has probably had more information on all of its citizens than ever before, is right when this happens. Meaning like, because, a lot of people are going in, they're getting vaccinated, they're giving all their, I know the MCP card, like I don't really know all the lingo, but I know a lot of people are divulging all their information within the past year to the medical system here. And now someone's got access to it.
It's either in somebody's hands, again, possibly held at ransom, which if you're able to hack the system to that much of a degree where the government is looking at you saying, okay, what do you want? If that's the case, that's scary because you're not putting a small price tag on that. Mm-hmm. If you know that the ball is in your court, then you can put whatever price tag on that you want. That's scary. But also, if that is not the case and it's just some kind of short circuit or outage, then essentially that's also just as bad. If we're never going to get these files back, or if there are half of them are corrupted, then where does that leave us? And again, wrapping it up at a time when we're firing healthcare professionals, we're not going to let them continue to work because they're unvaccinated. Like, I think we got bigger fish to fry. You know what I mean?
We'll put I think we do have to put a pause on it and I'll have to bring you back on and maybe even do like a roundtable. I got another friend of mine coming to mind right now who I think would be fun to bring into this conversation. And maybe we do like a long format one, more a long format than this.
Yeah, man. I could talk forever about it.
Yeah. So yeah, well, I want to keep posted on your journey too, and see if they fire you or, whatever, like keep holding your ground, keep leading the way, paving the way, showing us examples and stories of people successfully standing up for their right to make a choice. That's really all it comes down to. But yeah, Travis, thank you for coming on Dream Chasers. Any just like parting words of wisdom before we shut it down?
No, man, just want to say that basically I appreciate it once again, and I get a feeling that there will be a three-peat. So maybe an update on the whole electronic system and where I'm at, because everything's changing pretty damn quick right now. So we're just going with the flow.
What's the name of the window that you mentioned, the theory?
The Overton window.
Overton window. Yeah, because everything's happening quickly with this Overton window. So awesome. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us, investing your most valuable resource with us, your time. And same to our listeners and viewers. Thank you guys for hanging out with Travis and I here today on Dream Chasers, Interviews with the Future. We will catch you in the next episode. Remember, in all you think, say, and do, take it to the next level.
Thanks, brother.